Okay, so let's do a quick review. We are discussing what makes differences in translations. And I think there are three main things. Is it a literal or a dynamic translation? How do they handle? I did. It just says recording started. Um, so how do they handle the gender issues? Um, do you translate it as man or person? Those kinds of things. We're going to talk about that starting next week. And then how do they handle New Testament quotations of the Old Testament? And we'll talk about that in 3 weeks, I think. So we're on the tail end of the literal versus dynamic discussion. And the main issue is that people are saying that literal translations just translate word for word, and they use the literal meaning of the word, and they let you do the interpreting. And so the question is that possible? Is that really what's going on? So what I'm doing is going through just the types of interpretive decisions that you have to make as you're doing translation. And so we're comparing a lot of different verses with several different translations to see what they've done. And so far we've talked about word meanings and that words don't really have a literal meaning. I got a lot of pushback on that. People are going, well, can we say it usually means that? And yeah, we could say that. But if it doesn't mean that in this verse, I don't know how that's helpful. Now, it's appropriate in situations where you have a word that, like lip, it usually means lip, but we're using it to mean voice or language. Okay. So I would use it in that sense. But if I said, don't be giving me any lip, now we switched to idioms. So there's such a range of how words are used. And speaking of idioms, we talked about that. Let me get out of your hair. That's right up your alley. We use phrases like that, and we know what it means. But if it's another language, they're going to have no idea. And so, ESV said, well, we take into account idioms and we translate them. But then we saw that about half the time they don't, and about half the time the dynamic translations don't. So everybody's kind of inconsistent as to whether or not they decide that we need to translate this idiom or not. We talked about word order. That doesn't really make a lot of difference in the meaning. It just makes for some awkward English, I think. And we spent quite a bit of time on grammatical decisions and especially the genitives. And so a noun that's in the genitive case, the New King James translates it with of most of the time. And some people like that. I had several people say, well, I really like it when they just use of, so I can do the interpretation of what this means here. And sometimes it's helpful, and sometimes it does work to use of, but sometimes it actually means something different. And Jim Rabel's not here, but he pointed out the King James says the faith of Jesus Christ in Galatians 2:16. That means it's a subjective genitive. It's Jesus's faith. Every translation, even the New King James, changed it to faith in Jesus Christ. The Net Bible put it back, actually, but we're making interpretive decisions about all those things. And then we talked about chiasm, and that can help you if you recognize the chiastic structure, can help you with your translation, or can verify that your translation is correct because it just discovered the chiasm. And we mentioned the parable of the prodigal son last week. So I thought I'd go grab that chiasm just to show you. The numbers up there are the verse numbers. And so in verse 12, it says he left with all the money. Okay, so the son was lost. And he said he lived a wild lifestyle. Okay, and so there was a wild party. And then it said he spent all his money and began to be in need. Verse 14. He was feeding the pigs, which is a violation of the unclean laws. So there's the sin that you've got on number 15. He was hungry, but no one would give him anything to eat. So he was total rejection by his friends. And he says I'm dying of hunger. My father's, workers eat better than me. So he recognized his need and decided he would return to his father. He gets back, the father hugs him. So there's total acceptance. And he confesses to his father, I sinned. And the father said, bring the robe, the ring, and the sandals. So they have total provision. And he says, let's kill the fattened calf and celebrate. So we have a planned party because the son of mine was found. And so the center of the chiasm is repentance. And then the older son, he comes in and goes, what's going on? So he's suspicious. Well, they say your brother is back. And he got angry. And so the father goes out to invite him in. And he says, I worked like a slave all these years for you. But that son of yours squandered all your money. Okay. And the father says, all that I have is yours. So we see the father's effort. And it's appropriate to celebrate because your brother has been found. And then it leaves you hanging. And so the question is, the Pharisees, what is their reaction going to be? So anyway, I think that one's really cool. Some guy named, what was his name? Kenneth Bailey came up with that. So, okay. Any thoughts or questions before we move on? Okay, I should have probably covered parallelism before chiasm because chiasm is a form of parallelism. Parallelism is they just say the same thing two times, back to back. Chiasm, they say it spread out over that structure. But here's an example. It's everywhere, but this is just an example. Psalm 8, when I look up at the heavens which your fingers made and see the moon and stars which you set in place. So same thing said twice. Of what importance is the human race that you should notice them? Of what importance is mankind that you should pay attention to them? So again, same thing, said twice. You made them a little less than the heavenly beings. You crowned mankind with honor and majesty. You appoint them to rule over your creation. You have placed everything under their authority. So we'll see this everywhere, okay? And so it can be helpful to understand what the passage means when you're running across parallelism. And for example, in Proverbs 17:17, it says, a friend loves at all times and a brother is born for adversity. I remember sitting in a Bible study 15 years ago, Paul Johannan, I only think one person knows here, a couple people know him. He was teaching, he goes, this is a confusing verse. And I said, not if you have a good translation. And he said, shut up, Hampton. And so a couple years after that, we were at the family camp in Big Sandy, or a week-long camp out with homeschool people. And every night they have a speaker. And this 80-year-old guy preaching from the King James is giving his sermon. And he says, a brother is born for adversity unless he's a godly man. And I went, does he not understand this verse either? Why not? Well, because it's really not that clear. It didn't say but a brother. I mean, it just says and. But the verb is implied there. If you look at the New Living Translation, a brother is born to help in time of need. Okay. And so it's a parallel thought. It's not a contrasting thought. So if it's confusing in English, the translator should make it easy to understand. Okay. Here's another one. The wicked return to the grave, all the nations that forget God. Same thing in the NRSV. Okay. The Net Bible says the wicked are turned back and sent to Sheol. This is the destiny of all the nations that ignore God. Okay. And so that the verb is implied. Okay. And so we should provide it. And the NLT said this is the fate of all the nations who ignore God. Now the Message just says the wicked bought a one-way ticket to hell. So there's no nations, there's no forgetting God. So not very good. And the NIV 2011 changed it to the wicked go down to the realm of the dead. And the word return didn't make any sense anyway, because in English, return means go back where you came from, right? And they didn't start in the grave. So, and that's not even the King James. King James says turn back. Okay, so that's parallelism. Sometimes it helps if the translator fills in the extra words so you recognize the parallel thought. Okay. Okay, wordplay. Well, let me tell you a story first. Back when I was 15, I was cleaning up around construction sites, hauling the leftover stuff to the next job and to the dump. And I was working with David, who was deaf, who was 17, and George, who was 15, my age. And so I learned some sign language like boss is coming, get to work, And so one time I asked George, I said, so how do you say lettuce as in head of lettuce? And he goes, I said, okay. So I waved David down and go, let's go.
Let's go. Yeah.
And he looks at George, and George just starts laughing. He says, he doesn't know lettuce. Sounds like let us.
Yeah.
Okay. Wordplay doesn't work with the deaf person. Well, the Hebrew does that a lot. Okay. And so in Amos 8:2, it says, what do you see, Amos? And he says, I replied, a basket of summer fruit. Then the Lord said to me, the end has come for my people, Israel. I will no longer overlook their sins. So the word for fruit is kates, and the word for end is ha-kates. And so what's really going on is a wordplay saying, what do you see? I see kates. Well, ha-kates. It's time for judgment. Okay. And so the New American Standard, all the RSV translations in New King James, everybody says summer fruit. Now, I think that the NLT and the NIV were very clever to say, I see ripe fruit. The time is ripe for judgment. That's not the same kind of play on words, but I campaigned for us to do that in the net, and the Hebrew guy was like, no, I'm not doing that. So, but I think that's a really clever way to do it. The connection between summer fruit and end, hates and ha-kates. So it's just kind of like my lettuce example. It's just the sound of the word that's being used. Okay.
It works.
No, it doesn't work in English. No, and that's everywhere. So so you just kind of lose out on that most of the time. But while we're in that verse, let's talk about illusions. Net says, I will no longer overlook their sins at the end. New American Standard, I will spare them no longer. RSV, ESV, and New King James, I will never again pass by them. And then the New Living Translation and the NIV say, I will spare them no longer. So what do you think about when you see pass by? Anything come to mind? Passover?
Out of sight.
Huh?
Out of sight. You won't see them.
Yeah. I think Passover, like I said, is probably an illusion, right? Because God passed over the Israelites and he spared them. So now he's not going to pass by them. So here's the situation where maybe we should have translated it pass by to keep the illusion. It's not that hard to understand what pass by means here. Okay. And so, but literal New American Standard went with I will spare them no longer. Did they not see the illusion? Is there not an illusion there? So I think there is. So I think pass by is good. Now let's go to Isaiah 31, verse 5.
Out of curiosity, how important is it we see the illusion rather than just the concept?
Well, I don't know. I don't know how important it is. I mean, it's just if there's an illusion going on, it'd be nice to be able to see it. And then you can decide, you know, if you're not seeing it, then you're not going to go down that rabbit hole. Right. And so there might be more going on. Um, so notice the net has, I'll read those in it. Just as birds hover over a nest, so the Lord of heaven's armies will protect Jerusalem. He will protect and deliver it. As he passes over, he will rescue it. The NIV has Passover. NASB, Passover. NLT, Passover. New King James, Passover. RSV line, he will spare and rescue it. Like, okay, you got it right over here. You know, obviously a different translators working on a different book, but they didn't do it here. Okay. The only one that's actually consistent, because nobody got it right except the King James and the ESV on the last verse. The only one that gets it as consistent is the New King James. So anyway, so those would be allusions that I would think would be important to try to keep when you're translating. You're like, you got to think of so many things, you know. Mark Strauss gives an illustration of an illusion. He's in 1 Corinthians 21:20 through 25. It says, where is the wise man? Where is the expert in the Mosaic law? Where is the debater of this age? Has God not made the wisdom of the world foolish? For since in the wisdom of God, the world by its wisdom did not know God, God was pleased to save those who believe by the foolishness of preaching. For Jews demand miraculous signs, and Greeks ask for wisdom. But we preach about a crucified Christ, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. So it's pretty obvious what the main idea in that paragraph is wisdom, right? So then we go 2 chapters later, and 1 Corinthians 3:10, the net, the ESV, and the NRSV say, according to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, but someone else builds on it. And the NIV and the NLT say, as an expert builder. And the King James, New King James, and New American Standard say, as a wise master builder. So the word is Sophia, which is usually means wisdom, right? So by not translating it wisdom or wise builder, he says this is an allusion back to that whole passage. Okay. So those are the kinds of examples of allusions that we have to be thinking about as we're translating. And I think what stands out to me is that it's not that the literal do it better. They're inconsistent too, you know. They're all trying to make decisions about these verses. Okay. Okay. Why? I don't get why bakers aren't wealthier. They make so much dough, right? So ambiguities. An ambiguity is when a word can be understood more than one way. Okay. And it is the foundation for lots of dad jokes. So sometimes the author intends an ambiguity. Okay. He wants both meanings to be caught. Okay. And so I, as a translator, have to recognize that there's an ambiguity going on there. And is there an English word that has the same two meanings as this Greek word? And that's rare that would happen. Okay. And if there's not such a word, then I have to pick one. I can't leave it ambiguous. There's also a bad side of ambiguity. If the author didn't intend for there to be ambiguity, and I pick an English word that is ambiguous, now I've introduced ambiguity. And so when Piper says, just translate the words and I'll figure out the ambiguity, I'm kind of going, I don't know how you would do that. So in John 3:3, Jesus says to Nicodemus, I tell you the solemn truth, unless a person is born from above, he cannot see the kingdom of God. All the other translations say born again. The Greek word there can mean born above, from above, or born again. And Jesus is probably meaning born from above. Nicodemus is going born again, and he's misunderstanding because of the ambiguity. And that's where the conversation goes. Okay. And the Net Bible says this word can be either, and that Nicodemus is misunderstanding. So we can't keep that ambiguity in English. Okay. And then Jesus does it again a few verses later. He says, the wind blows wherever it will, and you hear the sound it makes, but do not know where it comes from and where it is going. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit. So wind and spirit, same word.
On that last example, you have to decide, do I translate it the way Jesus intended it or the way that Nicodemus misunderstood it? If you translate the way Jesus intended, you don't understand what Nicodemus is talking about.
Right. That's a good point.
Translate it the way Nicodemus misunderstands it, you're missing what Jesus said. You can follow what I'm
Yeah.
saying. So it's like you're caught in a no-win situation.
That's true. I hadn't even thought of that. And so the Net Bible does born from above. So
Jesus' interpretation.
yeah.
Which makes it harder to understand Nicodemus, but you understand what he misunderstood it.
Yeah. So maybe all these years, for 400 years, we should have said, are you born, instead of saying, are you born again? We should have been saying, are you born from above?
That's where you put in your footnotes of all the and.
Well, we did have a footnote on that. So, but that's a good point, James. Yeah.
Like, born again is just a metaphor that's in Christianity, right? Like that's just something we all say because it's from the Bible or whatever. Instead of self-understanding.
Yeah. Bill, I didn't know that until I was putting together the slide and thinking through this.
In one sense, it's not too far off though, because if you're born from above, you do have a physical birth and a spiritual birth. So, I
True.
mean, you're not too far off.
Right.
And rebirth is definitely a concept in.
Right.
Okay. Now, Hebrew, ruach, I think, means wind and spirit. So you could go from Greek to Hebrew and have that kept, but we can't do that in English. Okay. 1 Thessalonians 4:4. He says in verse 3, for this is God's will that you become holy, that you keep away from sexual immorality. And then in verse 4, he says that each of you know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor. But the Net and the NIV and the RSV line say, possess your own body or control your own body. Okay. So the word vessel, like a jar is a vessel, but the body in Greek thought is a vessel for the spirit. Okay. So when he uses the word vessel in this sense, he probably does mean body. Okay. But because that's been translated as vessel, there's a whole line of interpretation that says that could be a wife. Okay. So it's ambiguous. And the question is, was Paul trying to be ambiguous with the word vessel? Did he mean your own body and maybe your wife? Or did he just mean body? Okay. And so I don't know the right answer. I haven't studied this verse enough, but my questions are, did the English translation vessel leave this ambiguous when it wasn't supposed to be? Yeah, right.
Romans 9 probably would help because there he talks about, will the clay say to the potter, why did you make me this way? And he goes on to say, what if God, wanting to show his power, basically had mercy for vessels of mercy and then wrath for those vessels for destruction. So similar concept there. We're using the word vessel and the idea of clay and then being made from clay, specifically his body. So sometimes you can find clues from.
Yeah, no, that's good point.
Passages.
So I guess my point is that, you got to decide, is it supposed to be ambiguous, and you try to leave it. And you don't want to introduce ambiguity when there's not, like they might have done here. Okay. So you can't just translate the words and leave it and let the reader figure out the ambiguity. That doesn't usually work. Now, here's a place where it talks about the revelation of Jesus Christ. Is this the revelation about Jesus Christ or the revelation from Jesus Christ? And the answer is yes. Right?
Yes.
So this is a place where using of for the genitive actually leaves it ambiguous and it works. Okay, so that happens sometimes. And that's what we've done. But notice the NLT, they took a side. They said it's the revelation from Jesus Christ. And the Message says it's the revealing of Jesus, the Messiah. So they lost the ambiguity there. Okay. So questions about ambiguity? Okay, sentence structure. I think the NIV got a bad rap for leaving out the therefores. Well, let me get to that next. Let me get ahead of myself. So let's Hebrews 13:3 says, remember the prisoners as though in prison with them, and those who are ill-treated, since you yourselves are also in the body. And it's basically the same in the RSV, ESV, and the NASB. I asked several people, what does this mean? You are in the body. And every one of them said, well, we're in the body of Christ. I go, well, that makes sense when you read that verse, but that's really not what's going on. It says there's two as those. And I don't know why the literal translations didn't keep the second as though and translated it as since. But it says, remember those in prison, and I'm reading that, as though you were in prison with them, and those ill-treated, as though you too felt their torment. Okay? And so this in the body is really the Greek idiom that is feeling your pain. Okay? And so I diagrammed it. And this is the structure of the sentence. And you can see the parallel thought. He's right to the Hebrews. Remember, we like parallelism in Hebrew. And so that's all that's going on here is he's saying the same thing twice. Okay. And so, this is a situation where the literal translations are not preserving the structure. Okay. Now, what I was going to say a minute ago is the NIV got a really bad rap because they would leave out the fors and the therefores sometimes. And I remember my dad saying way back in the 70s or 80s, I guess, it's hard to ask what the therefore is there for if it's not there, right? And so that was a failing of the NIV 84. The Net Bible translators were aware of that and, made sure that we included them. The NIV 2011 did put a lot of them back. Okay. And so, but not all of them. So anyway, that's kind of what's going on that's one of the reasons I think that literal translations are said to have better sentence structure because of the failing of the NIV there. And so, they put it back in Romans 1:16, the wrath of God. In verse 18, though, they didn't. So they still have the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men. Where the others in ESV have for the wrath of God. And the NLT has the same issue as the NIV. Okay. We're going back to Strauss.
Yeah, but I would say on that one, some English stylists say that you shouldn't start a English sentence with the word for. But Greek loves to start
Good point.
with gar, or especially Paul. And so you've got this tension. Paul is showing subordination with the word. Whereas English stylists can say, we don't like this. Well, there's too many of them.
Right.
So let's get rid of
And this one may not actually have any causal,
Right.
But
when you get rid of it in English, then it's harder to see the relationship between one verse and another. That one is a subordinate idea to the previous.
Right.
And so that's the tension that people have. But the NIV, got to give them credit though, because they look at their translation every 10 years or so, and they make changes you know, if they
Yeah.
feel like they just warranted it, and that was one where they did.
Yes, they did. They changed a lot of, yeah, I've seen a lot of good changes in the 2011. So
Not, they weren't, we chose where to put those numbers.
That's
to
true.
separate. So it was all one thought in the original.
Yeah.
Manuscript.
good point. You remember when I read the paragraph about the debate was over long ago by Mark Strauss, the literal dynamic? Well, this is the next paragraph. So he's proven that literal translations aren't really translations. He says they're tools. He goes, this is not to suggest that formal equivalence versions have no place in Bible study. They are very useful tools, especially for those with only a basic knowledge of the original languages, since they give the reader a view of the formal structure of the Hebrew or Greek. They can be helpful in number one, identifying the structure of the original text, identifying the Hebrew Greek idioms and formal patterns of language, some of which have cultural significance. Number three, doing word studies. Four, identifying potential ambiguities in a text. And five, tracing formal verbal allusions, which might be obscured by idiomatic renderings. And when he says idiomatic renderings, he doesn't mean using idioms. He means just plain English, good English. So I read this and I was like, okay, it hasn't been that helpful for recognizing structure in the examples that I was looking at. The chiasms, for example, in Galatians 2:16, the structure in Hebrews 13:3, right? If he's talking about word order, then we saw plenty of places where they mixed up the word order and it wasn't following the Greek. And it's like, why did they change that? So I was kind of going, I'm not sure. Maybe it can sometimes, but I found plenty of examples where they didn't. And then he talks about identifying the Hebrew or Greek idioms and formal patterns of language. So we saw that half the time they didn't translate the idioms, and half the time they did. We saw that both dynamic and literal are inconsistent. And so James put me on, I'm doing a study on see and take and greed and covetousness and chiastic structure of the Ten Commandments. And James pointed out that the evil eye is an idiom for greed. And so I'm tracking that down just this past week. And it says in the Matthew 20:15, the parable of the vineyard, where the owner pays everybody the same, even the ones that came to work late, and the ones that worked all day are angry. And he goes, am I not permitted to do what I want with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous? Envious. Okay. NIV, NRSV, envious. NLT, jealous. Message, stingy. RSV and ESV. Or do you begrudge my generosity? I had to look up begrudge. I knew how to use the word, but it actually means envy someone's possession or enjoyment of something. Okay. So that works. Then the New American Standard says, or is your eye envious because I am generous? Okay, so what have they done wrong? Is your eye envious? What's the idiom? Evil eye. This is like David was buried with his fathers. Remember that? They've got half the idiom. It's like he had to suffer consequences and eat the soup. You know, the idiom is laid down with his fathers and was buried. You don't say he was buried with his fathers. You say he died. So here they've got, is your eye envious? So they've got half the idiom and then the meaning. So that doesn't help me identify the idiom. Only the New King James leaves it as, is your eye evil? Okay, so they actually help me identify the evil. I mean, the idiom. Okay, but the other guys are not. So again, now, is it helpful for it to say evil eye if I don't know what evil eye means? Not really. So you're in a conundrum. Do I translate the idiom or not? So back to his thing, you know, do the literal translations help? with identifying idioms, I'd say sometimes, but not any more than the dynamic. Okay, it's also, they're useful for doing word studies. So I have a Schofield reference Bible from like the 70s, King James. I could go to the back and I can look in concordance and look up F, flesh, and it'll give me 20 places where the word flesh is used. And in every place that I go, the word flesh is used. Okay, so if I'm doing a word study, then that's not how we do word studies anymore. Now we go, what's the Strong's number? Where are all the places sarx is used? And then I can go look up those verses. So my question to you is, would you rather go to those 50 verses and have it say flesh everywhere? Or would you rather go to those 50 verses and have it say things like human, physical descendant, sin nature, mankind, and sometimes flesh? Okay. There's no right answer. If you like having the same word everywhere, then go get yourself an LSB, Legacy Study Bible, Standard Bible, right? Because that's their commitment, and that's what you like, and that's how you want to do your word study. Fine. If you'd rather have the translation tell you the different what meanings, then a more dynamic translation would be better. Okay.
Everybody says you should do your word studies based on the original languages.
Hmm?
For that reason, you
Right.
should really be doing your word studies
Correct.
based on original language. Right?
Yes. Yeah, and since we are
Yeah.
using looking up sarx with the Strong's number, and if you don't know any Greek, that's the best, that's kind of your only option. Okay, 4, identifying potential ambiguities in a text. And well, we just saw that not really. It's not really true either. It can be sometimes, but it doesn't really work out in the examples. And these are not examples I went looking to prove a point. These are just things that I run across sitting in church and somebody's reading from a different translation and I'm just going, why is that different? So there are probably better examples. And then 5, tracing formal verbal allusions, like the pass by one. Okay. So I kind of read through this list and I was like, Mark, I don't agree with you. So I wrote Mark a 3-page email and I gave him all these examples and I said, I don't see this. And I said, can we just not say that it's better to use a literal translation for these reasons, but just say it's better to use other translations because different translators had to make different decisions. And he did agree. And we ended up going to dinner in San Diego last November when I was at the convention. So they are useful, but not because they're literal, just because they're different. Bill Mount says it's not appropriate for any translation to say it is a literal or essentially literal. There is no such thing as a literal translation. No word has a literal meaning. There is not a single verse in any Bible that goes word for word. Not a single translation that translates every single Greek word with an English word. If you translate 8 out of 10 Greek words, why would someone think they have a higher view of inspiration than the person who translates 7 out of 10? Given the significant freedom each and every translation exercises with the Greek and especially the Hebrew, should we not all admit that we translate thought for thought, trying as hard as we can to communicate every single piece of meaning possible, and if possible, replicating the form of the original? So because he was talking about 7 out of 10 and 8 out of 10, in the same article, he has the following. The ESV has 757,626 words. New American Standard has 775,853, which makes 18,227 less words in the ESV. The Greek and Hebrew combined have 563,000 words. Okay. So the ESV has 194,000 more words than the original, 34% more words. And he says something more than simply translating words is going on. So didn't realize there was that difference, much difference. He goes on to say plenary, I pronounce that word wrong every time. Plenary inspiration requires us to believe that every piece of meaning conveyed by all the words of Scripture is true. Verbal inspiration requires us to believe that the words used by the human authors accurately reflect the mind of God. Therefore, if I wanted to be argumentative, I would argue that translations focused on meaning show a higher view of inspiration because they are not content to use words that are vague or confusing or unnecessarily ambiguous. They work harder to convey the inspired meaning given to the authors by God. So, so concluding thoughts on this section, you can't translate the Greek and Hebrew words without interpreting. And so every translation requires interpretation, literal and dynamic. And literal translations aren't actually literal, and though they have no special value as literal translations, they just have value because different guys, different translators wrestled with the meaning of the text and had different interpretive opinions. And just some thoughts that kind of came to me was like, if literal translations were more accurate, then they wouldn't differ. Right?
Seem to be.
And we wouldn't even, all we would need is one. We would just all carry an RSV. There was no need to update, make a New American Standard or an ESV, right? And so I think translations are actually less accurate if you don't understand them. I know we've had people say, well, just because I don't understand it doesn't mean it's accurate or not accurate, but we're not talking a Perl programming manual about variables and subroutines and that kind of stuff. This is the Word of God, and it's not supposed to be so technical that I don't understand it. So I feel like one thing that has stood out is that the translations are inconsistent as to how they apply their translation philosophy. And so, you know, the bottom line is you got to have multiple translations and compare them. And so netbible.org has the ability, if you click on a verse and say parallel, then it'll give you 10 different translations. And so you can kind of look through.
So I shouldn't throw away my NIV yet.
No, I wouldn't throw away any of them. But it's kind of hard to have 4 translations with you at all times. So thank goodness for cell phones. I have my Logos app and I've got the net and the ESV and, you know, and so I can swipe left and right and compare. So, yeah.
Chapter and verse religions was that the KJV?
What point were,
At what point were the chapter and verse numbers introduced?
well, I know that in the New Testament, the verse numbers were done in 1551 by Stephanus for the Greek text. I don't know when the chapters were done. I think there were chapters before that.
Yeah, in the Middle Ages, that
Yeah.
before that, the lectionaries had just marks saying this is how far you read in the Gospels for this Sunday, and so there were lectionary marks that kind of separated the sections into units that basically is for liturgical purposes.
Right. And they probably used that when they started putting in verse numbers.
They probably check that helped with
Because people had been reading the text and
Right.
figuring out what the sections were. And,
Right.
yeah, good question.
Follow up to that, why weren't those boundaries ever changed in the different translations? Is it just for the sake of standardization across?
Why is what?
The chapter verse numbers were never moved around.
Changed.
Yeah, why did they not change them?
That just.
Yeah, that-
I mean,
It's just too inconvenient. You know, everybody's got, we have places in the Net Bible where we start some paragraph at the end of a previous chapter, and it really, you know, it's a little confusing, and it's really hard when you're dealing with the computer and you're trying to lay things
You know
out.
what John 3:16 is for 500 years. We want to change the verse number in the church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Right.
You know. No, right.
You're looking up
For
the
liturgical
Right,
purposes.
right.
Now you. Numbering system.
Yes. Yeah, that would be confusing.
I find it interesting that in the Bible when they quote, they say elsewhere it says, on the scroll of Isaiah it says, They didn't feel the need to use numbers.
Yeah.
Yes,
They didn't have-
that's,
Well,
well,
Yeah.
I like the one in Hebrews, we're gonna look at next week, but Hebrews 2, when he quotes the Psalm 8 that we started off reading parallelism. And somewhere someone says, and I'm like, I like the way this guy quotes stuff. So, because I'm not very good with chapter and verse. So, yeah, bro.
Your points 3 and 4 are parallelism.
There you go.
Dying.
But you know, it did make a different point. It kind of makes it go, there would be only one. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll see you next week.
You.
Your voice held out.
When is the last class for this?
Just a minute. Let me get this thing stopped.
Thank you.